Please, you have to take this with you.
I can't. It won't change what I have to do.
Marry me until the mountain road opens, Flora said, lifting her mother's plain gold band between them. She knelt in Chester's ranch yard, dust streaking her cream dress from the long wagon ride, while he crouched across from her and stared from the ring to her face. In her other hand lay a corrected feed tally, bearing her own initials. 30 sacks of oats were missing, and the bad count had been hers. Chester Sloane did not reach for the gold band. He kept his weight on the heels of his boots, one hand on his knee so he would not reach for her arm and haul her upright. Late October of 1881 had been dry in the Animas country, but frost already sharpened the evening air. He looked again at the figures in her steady hand. 30 sacks. 2 days, she had known. The freight company, once a married household to keep Cottonwood bench through winter, Flora said. Her chin lifted slightly. Her eyes were braced for refusal, but there was no pleading in them. You need the pasture and hay shed for your herd. I need the wage and a room for Ellie. I will not come as your charity. Give me half the winter's work and half the say. Chester let the silence stretch. A wagon rattled somewhere on the Durango road. He had built a small herd and 2 freight teams by learning not to look away from bad numbers. Flora had done the wrong thing for 2 days, then carried the proof to his yard before asking him for anything. That mattered. Stand up, Flora, Chester said. His voice was flat, carrying the gravel of the dust. I don't talk terms with a woman in the dirt. She hesitated, then pushed herself to her feet. She brushed the dust from her cream skirt. You held this error for 2 days, Chester said, rising slowly to stand before her. I thought I could balance it. From the inbound freight, she said, looking straight at him. I was wrong. I will pay the shortage from my own fee, but I need the station contract to do it. Chester looked at the ring, then at her face. The bad count mattered. So did the order in which she had done this, first the truth, then the asking. Come inside, he said. He left the yard door open behind them, knowing Georgina Bell and Flora's sister Ellie would be arriving on the trailing wagon within the hour. The ranch kitchen was sparse, smelling of wood smoke and old coffee. Chester motioned to the heavy oak table. Flora set the gold ring on the scrubbed wood. She did not slide it toward him, and he did not put it in his pocket. It sat there, a piece of metal waiting for a purpose. Chester pulled out his own daybook. He didn't need to look at her tally again. He had the numbers in his head. 30 sacks of oats meant his wagon teams would be short by December. It meant he might have to sell 20 head of cattle early, taking the buyer's rate instead of waiting for the spring market. It was a heavy cost, but it wasn't a fatal one. Georgina brought the notice from the freight company, Chester said, tracing a line on his ledger with the blunt end of his pencil. They want an answer in Durango in 3 days. I can manage the provisions for the station, Flora said, taking a seat opposite him. I can handle the guest accounts, the meal counts, and the storeroom. You keep the herd, the freight teams, and the route safety. I want my wage paid directly to me, not to my husband. I want a separate room at the station. And I keep the ring when the road opens. Chester watched her. She was bargaining for her survival, but she was building walls at the same time. He respected the walls. He had built enough of them himself. I will take the herd and the road, Chester said. If you keep the provisions, your word stands on them. If I need feed for my teams, I ask you. If you need a wagon for supplies, you ask me. Neither of us reaches into the other's work without asking first. Flora blinked and some of the strain left her face. Agreed, she said softly. Outside the open window, Chester's gelding stretched its neck over the fence rail. The horse lipped at the pocket of Flora's traveling coat, which she had draped over a post, and tugged out the red cloth she used for marking feed bins. Chester watched the horse chew on it. He reached out the window, caught the cloth, and held it up just out of the horse's reach. The gelding snorted, stamping a hoof. The tension in the kitchen cracked. Flora let out a breath that caught in her throat, a small, genuine laugh escaping her. "Don't make him an accomplice to my bad habits," she said, the stiffness leaving her shoulders. "He's got enough of his own," Chester said, tossing the cloth onto the sill. The sound of wagon wheels crunched into the yard. Georgina Bell, the stout owner of the local mercantile, pulled the team to a halt. Beside her on the bench sat 15-year-old Ellie, wrapped in a heavy shawl. Ellie climbed down and walked into the kitchen, her eyes immediately finding the gold ring on the table. She looked at Flora, then at Chester, but said nothing. "The agent in Durango won't wait past Thursday," Georgina announced from the doorway, slapping dust from her gloves. "He wants a married couple on the manifest, or he gives the cottonwood bench to the Miller brothers." Flora stood up. She picked up the corrected tally sheet, not the ring. "I need a ride to Durango, Georgina. I have a debt to clear before I sign any manifest." The wagon ride to Durango the next morning took nearly 6 hours. Chester rode beside Georgina's wagon while Flora sat on the bench with her account book in both hands. At the mercantile, Flora went straight to the counter. Harris, the freight company clerk, was there over Georgina's manifests. "I miscounted the oats by 30 sacks, Flora said. "I found the error 2 days ago and tried to balance it. I failed. My autumn commission goes to Georgina for the replacement cost." Harris adjusted his spectacles and looked past her to Chester. "Sloane, you mean to let her run the bench provisions after that?" "The provisions are her lane," Chester said. "Ask her." Flora set her voucher on the counter. "The shortage is paid. I will give you the tally every Friday until you are satisfied with the count." Georgina took the voucher. "Your reference stays clean if the winter ends clean." Before they left, Chester had Harris write the winter agreement. Plainly, Flora would receipt for her own wages, and the money trunks and account book she brought remained hers. The civil marriage before the Justice of the Peace took less than 10 minutes, 2 answers, signatures, witnesses, and her mother's gold band. Outside, the wind off the Animas River cut through their coats. Mrs. Sloane, Chester said. Flora pulled her shawl tighter. "Flora will do until the ink dries." They walked back to the wagon, legally bound with an 18-mile road home and more distance than that still between them. The first days at Cottonwood Bench taught Chester more about the bargain than the paper had. The station was a low timber house with 2 guest rooms, a kitchen, a storeroom, and a barn broad enough for a freight team. Chester checked the roofed chimney corral rails and hay shed. Flora opened every cupboard and counted everything that could be eaten, burned broken, or lost. On the second afternoon, he found her standing on a chair in the storeroom, reaching for a flour sack he had put on the top shelf. "Do not say it," she said. Chester stopped in the doorway. "I have not said anything. You are about to tell me to get down. I was about to ask why the flour is above your head, because someone taller put it there." He looked at the shelf. He had been that someone. Without thinking, he crossed the room, lifted the sack down, and moved the coffee and salt with it. Flora stepped off the chair. "Chester." He heard the warning and stopped. "This is my storeroom." He looked at the sacks in his hands. She was right. "Where do you want them?" The question changed her face more than an apology would have. Flour low, coffee above it, salt by the door. Molasses on the bottom before Ellie drops a jar from shoulder height, and we walk on it until spring. Chester put each thing where she named it. Anything else? No. He turned to go. Thank you, Flora said. He glanced back. For moving flour badly twice, for asking the second time. That evening, Flora served beans, salt pork, and biscuits she called poor. Chester ate 3. You hate them, she asked. He reached for a fourth. Deeply. She pulled the plate toward herself. His hand closed around the edge before she could take it away. Ellie laughed into her cup. Flora smiled despite herself, and for the first time, the station sounded less like a place they had been assigned to keep, and more like somewhere people lived. By the second week of November, Cottonwood Bench Station was running under a cold gray sky. The work was endless and sharply divided. Chester spent his days in the saddle, moving his cattle to the sheltered pastures and managing the hay drops for the freight teams. Flora ran the station house. She counted the flour, portioned the lamp oil, and kept the fires burning. She gave Ellie the task of writing the daily meal counts, teaching her the numbers. One afternoon, a freight driver named Cobb stomped onto the porch mud, caking his boots. He found Chester fixing a trace chain near the barn. Sloane, the driver, called out, I need 2 extra sacks of oats on credit. Company will make it good next month. Chester finished tightening the link. He pointed with his wrench toward the station house where Flora was visible through the window checking the storeroom inventory. Provisions are her lane. You ask her. The driver grumbled but went inside. Chester watched through the glass. He saw the driver lean on the counter making his demand. He saw Flora shake her head, open her ledger, and point to a column. She refused the extra oats, but then she turned to the stove, poured a hot cup of coffee, and handed the man a wrapped portion of salted beef. The driver left the house looking unsatisfied about the feed, but not angry. Chester would have given the man a flat no and sent him on his way. Flora had saved the oats without sending an angry driver down the road. Word of the 30 missing sacks had traveled farther than Flora. Over the next 4 days, 2 other drivers tried her. One asked her to round his feed issue upward for road loss. Another claimed the Durango office had promised him credit but could show no written order. Flora opened the book for each man and refused both requests. I made 1 bad count in Durango, she told the second driver. I paid for it. I will not make another here. Chester stayed by the barn and let the answer remain hers. When the driver finally climbed back onto his wagon, Chester tapped the wrench once against the top rail and pulled the brim of his hat lower before the smile beneath it could become anybody else's business. By the end of the week, the jokes about 30 sacks had stopped. That evening, after the last wagon had rolled through and the station was quiet, Chester washed up at the basin. Flora was at the main desk balancing the day's receipts by lamplight. I'm riding up to the high pasture tomorrow to check the water lines before the hard freeze, Chester said, drying his hands. He paused, tossing the towel over a peg. The wagon can handle the trail. Come with me. Flora looked up from the ledger, her pen hovering over the inkwell. To check the water lines, no, Chester said, holding her gaze. To ride up the mountain? I want your company, Flora. I don't need your figures tomorrow. It was the first thing he had asked of her, simply because he wanted her near him. Flora held his look for a long moment, her pen completely still. I will be ready at dawn, she said. The next day, they took the light wagon up the mountain. Flora admitted she could sit a horse for an hour, but not half a day, and still walk afterward, so Chester said nothing about saddling one for her. Wind had stripped the last leaves from the aspens. Chester cleared ice from the spring box while Flora stood nearby with her hands in her coat pockets. You said no figures, she reminded him. I have not given you any. You have the look. What look? The one that means you are counting something. Chester poured coffee from the small pot they had brought. I was counting how long before you accused me. She took the single tin cup from him. Less than a minute. He had forgotten the second cup. They shared the first. After a while, Flora said my father kept a livery stable in Pueblo. Good with horses, less good with money. That combination is not rare. He died owing more than he owned. My mother kept us afloat. She could make $5 behave like 10. Chester glanced at the band on Flora's hand. I hated bringing her ring to your yard like a bargaining chip, Flora said. I thought if I brought something that mattered, you would know I meant the offer. I knew. Because of the ring, because of the tally. She looked at him. The ring told me you were desperate, Chester said. The tally told me you would put your name under the worst part. That is not flattering. No. A small smile touched her mouth. I think I prefer it. So do I. On the ride down, the silence between them was no longer guarded. She had told him something because she chose to not, because a marriage paper entitled him to it. When they returned that night, the station was empty of travelers. Ellie had gone to sleep in the back room. Flora finished the supper dishes, dried her hands, and walked into the main room. Chester was sitting at the long table with a freight map spread before him. Flora did not go to her desk. She pulled out the chair beside him. I want an hour, she said. No station business, no feed counts, no wages. Chester set down his pencil. No cattle, no cattle. That is severe. 1 hour. He took his hat off the table and hung it on the peg behind him. Agreed. They talked until the stove burned low. He told her about his first winter on the ranch, when pride had nearly cost him 3 calves because he refused a neighbor's help. She told him how after her father died, she had learned to keep household accounts before she was old enough to want the responsibility. Neither of them made a speech about trust. They simply kept talking. When the hour was over, Flora glanced at the clock and did not move. Chester noticed. He wanted to ask whether she intended to stay for a second hour. He wanted more dangerously to ask whether she had begun to think of the marriage as anything other than a winter arrangement. Ellie's door creaked in the back hall. Flora stood. Good night, Chester. Good night. He remained at the table after she left and knew he had let the easiest chance for honesty pass because he had been afraid of the answer. 2 days later, the first real snow came wet and early. It did not close the road, but it slowed an inbound supply wagon long enough to leave Cottonwood Bench without its usual margin of oats. At dusk, a second freight outfit rolled in, unplanned, its team blowing hard from the climb. Flora counted what remained in the station bins, then crossed the yard to Chester's barn. 4 sacks stood against the wall for his own wagon team. I need one of yours, she said. Chester looked past her at the tired freight horses. Take 2. 1 gets them through the night. 2 puts your team short if the supply wagon's still out tomorrow. You are asking for 1 yes. He dragged 1 sack forward, then 1. Flora carried the issue into her book before the sack crossed the yard. The delayed wagon arrived near noon the next day. Before Chester came in for coffee, she had 1 fresh sack set back against his barn wall. You could have waited, he said. I said, I would ask before touching your work, Flora replied. I did not say I would keep your oats. Chester looked from the returned sack to her. Their rules had begun as walls. Somewhere along the way, asking had turned them into doors. The illusion of their isolated world broke 3 days later. The Durango mail sack arrived on a Tuesday wagon. Chester opened the company envelope at the long table and read the page twice. Flora came in from the storeroom. What is it? The railroad has changed the freight work out of Durango. Cottonwood Bench closes in 6 weeks. Her hand tightened on the chair back. Your pasture. I move the herd home and sell some cattle early. At a loss. Yes. The work that had put them under one roof was ending. Chester's first thought was ugly in its simplicity. He had credit enough to buy time. He could offer the company better terms and keep the station open. Then Flora said, "Do not spend money keeping this place alive because you do not know how to ask me to stay." Chester looked at her. She had found the thought before he could hide it. I had considered it. The admission cost him. Flora sat across from him. "I proposed because winter cornered us. I do not want either of us wondering later whether winter kept us married too." He nodded slowly. "Then we close when the company closes," she said. She worked the gold band over her knuckle and placed it between them. "We live apart for 1 month. If we still want this when neither of us needs it, we will know." Chester wanted to tell her he already knew, but he had promised her a way out, and certainty could become another kind of pressure if he laid it on her now. He picked up the ring and held it back to her. "Keep it. Wear it, or do not. But do not leave it with me as if the month is already decided." Flora closed her fingers around the gold and slipped it into her pocket. The next day, Harris rode up from Durango with one last offer. Chester could keep the pasture for late beef drives, but Flora's name would come off the wage book while the company kept her feed arrangement. "No," Chester said. "You have not heard the rate. I heard the condition. She hit a shortage. She paid for it. You will lose money. Then I lose it." Harris rode out angry. Flora had heard from the doorway. "You could have taken the pasture and hired me yourself, and let him use your work after calling you unfit to do it. Do not make me a reason you blame later." Chester met her eyes. "The refusal is mine. If it costs me, I pay for it." For a moment she said nothing. Then quietly, "Thank you." Chester wanted to touch her. He did not. The important thing was that she had heard his answer while she still had every right to leave. The next morning, Chester expected the station to feel colder. It did not. Flora still corrected Ellie's sums at breakfast. Chester still brought in wood. A traveler still complained about the East Room mattress, as if the company had closed the station solely to inconvenience him. That ordinary morning did more to hurt Chester than the letter had. 6 weeks were now numbered days. A few nights later, he came in late from checking the lower pasture and found one plate covered near the stove. "You did not have to hold supper," he said. "I did not," Flora answered from the desk. "Ellie did." From the back room, Ellie called, "That is not true." Flora shut her eyes. Chester sat before either sister could remove the plate. The stew had thickened from waiting. He ate all of it. Another evening, Flora found him tightening the hinge on her storeroom door. "That hinge worked," she said. It complained. So do most useful things. He tested the screw. "Chester." He looked up. "You do not have to improve this place before we leave it?" He heard the other meaning beneath the words. "You do not have to make departure harder by acting like there will be a next winter here." "No," he said. "I suppose I do not." Flora touched the repaired hinge with one finger. "Thank you anyway." The weeks before leaving did not become a false courtship. They became something more dangerous ordinary. Flora left the day's count on the table where Chester could read it without opening her book. Chester marked his expected return time on the slate by the kitchen door. Once, in the half-dark before dawn, he found her in a wool shawl with her hair braided loosely down her back and had to remind himself that wanting to reach for her did not give him leave to do it. He began to understand that the month apart was not meant to punish either of them. It was meant to remove every excuse. One evening in the last week, loose snow hissed against the windows and the station had no travelers. Ellie read at the end of the table while Flora mended a tear in Chester's work coat. She had asked before taking the coat from its peg. Chester had said yes, then spent 10 minutes pretending the sight of her stitching his sleeve meant nothing. When she finished, she held it out. "Try it." He put the coat on. Flora frowned at the shoulder. Lift your arm. Chester did. Higher. If this is punishment for the oats, it is late. Higher. Ellie turned a page without looking up. She cannot reach the seam if you argue. Chester raised his arm. Flora stepped close enough to smooth the repaired cloth beneath his shoulder. Her fingers pressed once through the wool. Chester went still. She noticed. So did Ellie, judging by the sudden intensity with which the girl studied her book. Flora lowered her hand. It will hold. Good. Neither moved. Chester could have filled the silence with a joke. A month earlier he would have. Instead, he said the thing that had been troubling him. Are you frightened of the month? Flora looked at him. Yes. Relief and pain arrived together. So am I. I thought you might be glad to have your quiet house back. I have had a quiet house. And he glanced toward the empty chair at the table where her ledger usually sat. I know what it costs now. Flora's face changed, not into a smile, but into something gentler. She set the needle in her sewing tin. That is the first sensible thing you have said all evening. There. You spoiled it. A laugh escaped her, small and tired. Chester took the repaired coat off and hung it on the peg. He did not ask her to change the month. He did not ask for a promise before its time. But later, when he went to bank the stove, he found Flora's account book beside his day book. She had left it there instead of carrying it to her room. He did not open it. He only moved his own book half an inch so the two would fit without one resting on top of the other. The exit date arrived with a bitter wind. Flora finished the final inventory and handed the keys to the freight driver shutting down the property. The closing figures balanced. Her debt was paid. Her reference was clean. Georgina's wagon was waiting. Flora and Ellie loaded their trunks. Chester stood on the porch, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The urge to tell Flora she did not have to go, that his ranch house was empty, and warm clawed at his throat. But if he offered the room now with winter at her back, neither of them would ever know whether she stayed for him or for the shelter. A month, Flora said, looking down at him from the wagon bench. A month, Chester agreed. The wagon pulled away, the sound of the wheels fading into the wind, leaving Chester standing alone in the cold. The month of separation was a slow, deliberate endurance. Chester moved his herd back to the home ranch. He fell into the old rhythm of checking the ice on the troughs, throwing hay and repairing harness. But the rhythm was broken. One cold morning, he stood at the stove, reached for the coffee pot, and poured 2 cups. He set them on the table. He stared at the second cup, the steam rising in the quiet room. He didn't throw it out, and he didn't drink it. He just let it sit there, an acknowledgement of the absence he refused to fill with a letter begging her to return. He kept the provision columns in his day book exactly as she had designed them, but he left the second signature line blank. Chester did not know what Flora's days in Durango looked like, and he refused to invent reasons to find out. What he learned came by ordinary channels. Georgina sent a bill for harness buckles and wrote at the bottom that Flora had rented a small counter and storage corner in the Mercantile. A rancher passing through mentioned that Mrs. Sloane had combined 3 households' orders for flour, oats, and salt, and cut the hauling cost for all of them. Chester read Georgina's note twice. Relief came first, then pride, then the harder truth. Flora did not need his wage anymore. On the 23rd morning, he saddled his horse before daylight. He told himself he needed seed prices from Durango. Standing with one foot in the stirrup, he heard Flora's voice as clearly as if she were in the yard. No invented reason to come after me. She had not used those exact words, but the meaning of their month had been plain. Chester took his foot down. He unsaddled the gelding. Keeping his word had usually required work riding farther, paying more showing up. This time it required him to stay home. He hated it. He stayed. When the mail pouch came 3 days before the agreed date, it carried a single invoice form headed Flora Brennan Provisions. No amount was due. No goods were listed. At the bottom, in Flora's hand, were 4 words, "The date still holds." On the morning of the agreed day, Chester woke before dawn. He saddled his horse, his hands moving mechanically in the freezing air. But he didn't ride out to the Durango Road. He stayed in the ranch yard. If she was coming, she had to come all the way. The sun was just breaking over the San Juan peaks, casting a pale golden light across the frozen mud of the yard when he heard the wagon. It was an hour earlier than they had agreed. Chester remembered the night at the station when she had asked him for 1 hour with no work between them, then stayed beyond it. Flora drove the small wagon herself. She wore the same cream dress, though now she had a heavy wool coat over it. She pulled the team to a halt, wrapped the reins around the brake, and climbed down. The gelding stood saddled at the rail behind Chester. His heavy riding coat was fastened to the throat, and frost silvered the leather gloves already on his hands. Flora's gaze moved from the horse to the gloves and stopped there for a beat. Chester saw the yard as she must, a man fully dressed for the road on the morning he had promised to wait. "I was not leaving," he said. He crossed to the gelding, stripped off one glove, with his teeth loosened the cinch, and lifted the saddle down into the fence. "I nearly rode out to meet you. Then I remembered this part had to be yours." Flora's shoulders eased, though she said nothing. Chester stepped away from the rail. He stopped 10 feet from her, letting her close the final distance. Flora reached into her coat pocket. She didn't pull out the ring. She pulled out a folded invoice sheet and handed it to him. Chester unfolded it. It was a supply order billed from Flora Brennan Provisions. "I don't need a station contract," Flora said, her breath pluming in the cold air. "I don't need your roof, and I don't need your wage to feed Ellie. I can live in Durango." Chester looked at the invoice, then at her. "Then why did you drive 18 miles in the frost?" "Because I wanted to keep the marriage," she said, her voice steady, refusing to look away. "Not as an arrangement. Not as survival. I want to be your wife. But I keep my account, and I keep my name on it." Chester let the paper drop to his side. The restraint he had forced on himself for 30 days finally shattered, not in anger, but in a profound, heavy relief. "I do not want a wife for a station that is already closed," Chester said, his voice rough, closing the distance between them until he was standing right in front of her. "I want you beside me, when there is no paper left to require it. I want to hear you tell me my feed plan is wrong. I want you to come home to me when the work is done." Flora's expression softened. She reached into her pocket again, her fingers trembling slightly in the cold, and drew out the plain gold band. She did not hand it to him. She held it between them. "Then ask me for it." Chester looked at the ring and then at her. He had spent a month proving he could keep silent. This was not the hour for more silence. "Flora Brennan, will you stay my wife when no company man, winter wage, or closed road has any claim on your answer?" "Yes." He took the ring and slid it onto her left hand. For a moment they stood there with their joined hands between them. "May I kiss you?" he asked. Flora gave a small, unsteady laugh. "You may." He kissed her once carefully in the frozen ranch yard. His gelding stamped behind the fence. A loose shutter knocked against the wall. Nothing grand happened, and Chester was grateful for that. He had wanted her in the middle of ordinary life, not in some moment that could never be lived again. When they drew apart, Flora touched the edge of the invoice still in his hand. "You owe me for 50 sacks of oats. I have not received them." "You accepted the invoice." "That is not the same thing. It will be by breakfast." Chester laughed, and Flora smiled up at him. "Come inside," he said. He opened the kitchen door and waited. Flora looked once toward the road behind her, then stepped across the threshold. 2 days later, Georgina and Ellie came out for supper. There was no need for another legal ceremony. Chester and Flora were already married. But after the dishes were cleared, Flora asked them to stay in the kitchen a few minutes longer. Chester stood across from Flora at the same oak table where they had written their first terms. "I will not use my money to make your choice for you," he said. Flora answered, "I will not hide a hard truth because I am ashamed of it. I will ask. I will answer." She paused, then added, "And I will ask too." Georgina studied Flora for a moment, then gave one satisfied nod. "Looks as if you no longer need my word to keep your reference clean," she said. Flora's mouth curved. "I still intend to keep it. I would expect nothing less." Ellie did not bother hiding her smile. The next morning, the kitchen settled into the quiet routine of a working day. Flora walked over to the long oak table, carrying her account book, and set it down right next to Chester's heavy leather daybook. She opened her book and slid the first real invoice across the wood. It was billed to Chester Sloane for 50 sacks of oats at full market price. Chester looked at the invoice. He didn't laugh, and he didn't offer to erase the debt. He opened his lockbox, counted out the exact sum in cash, and handed it to her. Flora recorded the payment under her own name, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Then Chester turned his daybook toward her. The provision page still carried the second signature line he had left blank during their month apart. Flora saw it. "You kept that. I did not know what else to do with it." She picked up his pencil and wrote her initials on the line. The little mark struck Chester harder than the marriage certificate had. The line did not make her his, and it did not make her work his. It meant only that she had come back to the same table and chosen to put her hand beside his again. 2 cups of coffee stood near the stove. For a month, Chester had trained himself to pour one. That morning, Flora had set out the second cup before he rose. He carried both to the table and gave one to her. Chester leaned over the map of the winter pastures. "I was planning to drive the herd to the western draw tomorrow," he said, tracing the route. Flora looked at her supply commitments, tracking the delivery routes she had promised her other clients. "The snow is going to block the western draw by next week," she said, tapping the northern ridge on the map. "If you move them to the northern pasture, my freight driver can drop your feed on his way to the mining camps. It saves you a day of hauling." Chester looked at the map, then looked at his wife. He didn't argue. He didn't assert his authority over the herd. He saw the logic, and he trusted the woman who presented it. "The northern pasture it is," Chester said, closing his daybook. Flora made a note for her driver. Chester moved one of his haymarks on the map. Neither decision erased the other. By breakfast, they had changed a cattle route a delivery day, and the place where Ellie would keep her school books when she came from town. It was not the life Chester had pictured before Flora drove into his yard. It was busier, less orderly, and required him to ask more questions than he had once considered necessary. He preferred it. They had married once because winter left them little room. At dawn, with every road open to them, they chose the same direction.